Frank Sinatra's life began in chaos and pain, and some say it shaped the hard-edged man he would later become. Born in 1915 during a difficult delivery that nearly cost him his life, he was pulled from his mother's womb with forceps that tore his face and left permanent scars. For a moment, the infant didn't breathe, and it took his grandmother's desperate slap on his back to jolt him into life. But the world he entered didn't greet him kindly. Those marks on his cheek and ear would haunt him for years, and the cruel nickname Scarface would follow him in childhood, reminding him that he was different, flawed, and destined to carry a chip on his shoulder. That early humiliation carved out a streak of pride that could turn ugly, and it fueled an obsession with being respected, no matter the cost. Growing up in Hoboken, New Jersey, he was the lone child of Italian immigrants who were too busy surviving to shower him with the warmth or attention he craved. His father was distant, and his mother was an iron-willed local power broker who had little patience for softness. Sinatra was left to fend for himself emotionally, yearning for the kind of family connection he never really had. That loneliness hardened him, sharpening his edges, making him quick to anger and even quicker to defend himself when he felt slighted. He learned early that charm could win people over, but intimidation could keep them in line. It was a lesson he would later wield like a weapon in Hollywood and beyond. When Sinatra developed an interest in singing, his parents brushed it off as a harmless distraction, hardly a respectable path for their son. But Sinatra, already simmering with a need to prove himself, refused to be dismissed. Eventually, his domineering mother, who had her own political ties in Hoboken, intervened, leveraging her connections to secure small-time singing gigs for him. He wasn't exactly humble about his growing talent, and those who worked with him saw flashes of arrogance even then. He climbed his way up by sheer force of will, landing his first real break with the Hoboken Four and later joining Tommy Dorsey's band, but he wasn't an easy man to work with. Behind the smooth voice and clean-cut image, there was an ambitious young performer who didn't care who he had to step on to rise. Bandmates noticed how quickly Sinatra's temper flared if things didn't go his way. If he felt overlooked, he turned icy, and if someone dared cross him, he had a sharp tongue and a long memory. Even in those early days, people whispered that Sinatra's charm had a dangerous edge. He didn't just want success, he demanded it, and he expected loyalty, sometimes through fear rather than friendship. That hunger for power, born from childhood scars both literal and emotional, laid the groundwork for the tough, often mean-spirited persona he carried into his adult life, the same persona that would make him as feared as he was adored. Frank Sinatra may have built his early career on idolizing Bing Crosby, but that admiration was laced with an undercurrent of ambition and ego that would later define how he treated anyone in his way. Crosby was the standard Sinatra wanted to surpass, the smooth, easygoing crooner every man wanted to be and every woman wanted to love. Sinatra mimicked Crosby's vocal style in the beginning, polishing his own sound to perfection, but he wasn't satisfied with just being a successor. He wanted to eclipse him. The media loved to stir the pot, framing their relationship as a friendly rivalry, yet there was always tension beneath the surface. While they eventually appeared together in duets and films, insiders knew Sinatra's respect for Crosby came with a side of competitiveness, a need to prove he could take the crown. Crosby may have been the man Sinatra studied, but he was also the man Sinatra wanted to dethrone. That was the darker side of his admiration. It wasn't enough for someone else to succeed. Sinatra had to be the one on top, no matter what it took. That competitive streak turned toxic as newer, younger singers began to emerge in the 1950s. When Eddie Fisher or Jimmy Roselli started capturing the attention of fans, Sinatra's famously thin skin couldn't handle it. Instead of gracefully accepting that the music industry always had room for fresh talent, he grew bitter and hostile. Eddie Fisher was a kid with a pure voice and a clean image, someone who threatened Sinatra's place in the spotlight. And while Fisher's rise was swift, Sinatra made sure his fall was even faster, allegedly pulling strings behind the scenes to block opportunities. Jimmy Roselli, a talented Italian-American singer from Sinatra's own neighborhood, experienced Sinatra's wrath even more directly. Roselli refused to perform at one of Sinatra's charity events, likely thinking nothing of it. But that small slight turned into a career-ending move. Sinatra reportedly blackballed him in the industry, using his influence to ensure Roselli couldn't get major bookings or airplay. For Sinatra, jealousy didn't stop at resentment. He actively destroyed careers to protect his own. It wasn't competition to him. It was war, and he had no problem playing dirty. That same ruthless nature extended beyond the music scene and into Sinatra's personal circles, where his associations grew darker and more dangerous. He surrounded himself with men like Sam Giancana and the Fischetti brothers, notorious mobsters whose names were whispered with fear. Sinatra didn't just socialize with these figures at glamorous parties. He sought their company, relished the power they represented, and used their clout when it suited him. It wasn't long before the FBI began compiling an extensive file on his activities, tracking his meetings, his suspicious friendships, and his unexplained connections to organized crime. He was never charged, always slippery enough to stay just outside the reach of the law. But the rumors were relentless. Whether it was fixing gigs, silencing critics, or intimidating rivals, people believed Sinatra wasn't above leaning on his mob ties when charm or intimidation alone wouldn't work. The public saw the polished singer with the velvet voice, but behind closed doors, there was a man who thrived on control and was willing to wield fear like a weapon. Sinatra didn't just want to be the best. He wanted to make sure no one else dared challenge him, and he was perfectly willing to let the shadows of the underworld help him keep it that way. Frank Sinatra's hunger for power didn't stop with music or Hollywood. It reached into politics, where he played the game with the same mix of charm and menace that defined the rest of his life. When John F. Kennedy ran for president, Sinatra became one of his loudest and most influential supporters. He wasn't just a celebrity endorsement. He actively pulled strings, hosting lavish fundraisers, rallying Hollywood elites, and even allegedly calling in favors from his mob friends to secure votes in key states. Sinatra liked being close to power, and backing Kennedy gave him exactly that. But his loyalty was never purely selfless. It was calculated. He wanted a seat at the table, a direct line to the White House, and the kind of influence that made him untouchable. For a while, he had it. He flaunted his access to JFK, bragging about their friendship like it was another jewel in his crown. But Sinatra couldn't resist pushing the limits. Behind closed doors, he reportedly had an affair with Kennedy's sister, Pat Lawford, a move that blurred the line between loyalty and betrayal. Even worse, the more Kennedy's team dug into Sinatra's personal life, the more alarmed they became at his deep, undeniable connections to organized crime. It all came crashing down when Kennedy distanced himself, cutting off the friendship without warning. For Sinatra, who saw himself as a kingmaker, the humiliation was devastating, and his reaction was as volatile as you'd expect. When JFK canceled a planned visit to Sinatra's Palm Springs home, opting instead to stay with Bing Crosby, Sinatra snapped. In a fit of rage, he reportedly smashed the helicopter landing pad he'd built for the president's arrival, destroyed furniture, and unleashed a profanity-laced tirade against everyone involved. It wasn't just disappointment. It was fury, the kind of blind anger he was known for. Sinatra didn't take rejection lightly, and he never forgave anyone who embarrassed him. That temper was legendary, and it wasn't reserved for politicians. Hotel managers, journalists, comedians, and even fellow entertainers learned quickly that Sinatra could go from charming to terrifying in a heartbeat. He smashed hotel suites to pieces when service didn't meet his impossible standards. He threatened comedians who made jokes about him on stage, sometimes sending his mob-connected friends to have a talk with them afterward. When he felt disrespected, he didn't just get mad, he sought revenge. He could ruin reputations with a phone call or make someone disappear from the Hollywood circuit entirely. People tiptoed around him, knowing that beneath the smooth voice and impeccable suits was a man who thrived on fear. Sinatra liked to remind everyone that he wasn't just a singer. He was someone you didn't cross if you valued your career or your safety. By the 1960s, Sinatra's life had grown darker and more complicated, and even his own family couldn't escape the chaos that seemed to follow him. In 1963, his son Frank Jr. was kidnapped in Lake Tahoe by 3 desperate men looking for an easy payday. Sinatra Sr. reacted as expected, not with calm strategy, but with a furious determination that had him pacing like a caged animal. He paid the $240,000 ransom almost immediately, but not out of pure fatherly love. He made it clear to everyone involved, including the FBI, that anyone responsible would regret it. While the Bureau eventually tracked down the kidnappers and recovered the money, there were whispers that Sinatra used his mob contacts to ensure the men would never forget who they had crossed. It wasn't just about getting his son back. It was about sending a message that even touching the Sinatra name would bring hell down on you. The ordeal was a media circus, but Sinatra handled it with the same mix of control and intimidation he showed in every part of his life. Even in a family crisis, he wasn't just a victim. He was still the man pulling strings and making threats. But no amount of influence could stop the inevitable decline of age. Sinatra, who had built his entire identity on being untouchable, began to unravel in his later years. Health problems mounted, heart issues, breathing trouble, and eventually the creeping fog of dementia that stripped away the sharpness that once made him feared. He hated the idea of growing weak and losing control. And those close to him said he became even more irritable and demanding, lashing out at anyone who dared remind him he wasn't the powerful figure he used to be. Still, even at the end, Sinatra insisted on surrounding himself with the symbols of the life he had carved out through charm and intimidation. When he died of a heart attack in 1998, he was buried with the things that had defined him: cigarettes, a bottle of whiskey, a Zippo lighter, and dimes. Always prepared, always projecting the image of a man who lived by his own rules. Bono once called Sinatra the 20th century itself, but many who knew him might say he also embodied its darker side. Ambition without mercy, charisma sharpened into a weapon, and a legacy as much about fear as it was about music. Even in death, Sinatra seemed to dare the world to forget who he really was. Not just a singer, but a man who demanded respect, even if he had to drag it out of people by force.